저는 바라카 컨템포러리 큐레이터 오다인이라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. 오늘은 2017년 같은 장소에서 2인전으로 저희 전시 참여했었던 알렉스 베르하스트의 개인 전시를 다시 열게 되었고, 그리고 이제 이게 팬데믹 이후 몇 년 만에 첫 퍼블릭 이벤트이기 때문에 이 기회를 정말 감사하게 생각하고 또 이렇게 많이 와주셔서 너무 감사하게 생각하고 있습니다. 이번 아티스트 토크는 알렉스 베르하스트, 저희 좌측에 앉아 계신 작가분 알렉스 베르하스트의 현재 지금 전시된 작품뿐만이 아니라 작가의 전반적인 작업 세계와 과정을 조금 짚어보면서, 그리고 먼저 토크를 발표를 해주실 예정이고, 그리고 마지막으로는 이제 편하게 질의응답으로 관객과 작가님이 직접 소통할 수 있는 자리였으면 합니다. 그리고 질의응답 때 물어보시지 못하더라도 저희 이 토크 이후에 좀 핫도그와 맥주가 준비될 예정이니 편하게 작가에게 다가가셔서 맥주 한잔 하시면서 대화를 나눠주시기 바랍니다. 먼저 제가 작가와 전시 소개를 간략하게 드리겠습니다. 벨기에 출생 작가인 알렉스 베르하스트는 영상을 주요 매체로 작업하는 멀티미디어 작가입니다. 알렉스 베르하스트는 앤트워프의 성 루카스 예술 아카데미에서 사진을 전공하고 베를린 하카베, 카르스루에 자카 M 등의 주요 기관에서 전시를 했고, 사우파울로의 파일, Electronic Language International Festival, Ghent New Technological Art Award, The New Face Award at Japan Media Arts Festival, 그리고 Ars Electronica에서 골든 니카상을 수상한 바 있습니다. 최신 테크놀로지를 이용해서 예술작품 서사적인 가능성을 탐구하는 알렉스 베르하스트의 작품 세계는 언어의 본질과 한계, 그리고 이를 둘러싼 사회적 관습에 집중합니다. 베르하스트가 새롭게 분석하거나 서술한 이야기들은 사진과 회화, 영화의 경계를 부유하는 인터랙티브 영상으로 선보여집니다. 지금 전시되고 있는 이루지 못한 미래 아카이브는 같은 이 바라카 서울에서 말씀드렸듯이 2017년 이후 2인전 이후 알렉스의 국내 및 아시아 첫 개인 전시입니다. 이 전시는 베르하스트가 지난 3년간 준비해온 여러 공공 아카이브에서 채취한 이미지들을 애니메이션화한 60개 채널 영상 설치 아키비스트와 실크 스크린 프린트 작품 전날의 섬, 다음날의 섬, 그리고 이상적 사고에 대한 철학적 고찰을 담은 비디오 게임 에드 호미넴을 전시하고 있습니다. 지금 저희 앉아 계신 이 지하 공간이 사실 그 비디오 게임을 위한 공간이었는데요. 저희 토크 이후에 관람하실 수 있겠습니다. 사실 이 전시된 작품들은 학자 소피 베라스트의 유토피아 언바운드라는 논문을 바탕으로 4가지의 유토피아를 탐구하고 있습니다. 각 유토피아는 집단주의 또는 개인주의와 진보적 또는 보수적 미래관을 교차하는 지점입니다. 베라스트는 이 논문에서 이 유토피아들은 사실 서양 역사 속에 다양한 예술 장르에서 반복적으로 등장하는 미학적 스테레오타입에서 발견할 수 있다고 주장합니다. 아키비스트와 에드 호미넴의 극본은 작가가 GPT-3라는 딥러닝을 통해 인간과 유사한 텍스트를 생성하는 인공지능과 협업하여 쓴 것으로 서사와 이미지로서 모두 이 두 작품들은 연결되어 있고 하나의 공상과학 영화 인터랙티브 극장이라고 할 수 있습니다. 그리고 이 모든 작품들을 엮고 있는 주인공은 변화입니다. 아키비스트에서는 나레이터에게 과거의 편지를 보낸 캐릭터이고, 아래층에 있는 비디오 게임 이 에드 호미넴에서는 플레이어가 변화의 역할을 하며 게임을 진행하게 됩니다. 변화라는 것은 중립적인 단어이지만 앞을 바라보는 미래적 개념이기도 한데요. 작가는 이번 전시하는 여러 맥락들에서 주인공으로 변화를 내세우면서 무언가 바뀌어야 하는 상태인 변화 혹은 이런 이상적인 미래관들이 어떤 것들을 의미하는지 고민하고 있는 것 같습니다.
Hi everyone. Thank you for coming on this really hot day. I think it's going to rain later, just at the moment when we're going to go outside, but it will be fine, I'm sure. So I'm Alex, obviously, and I'll be presenting my work today. I'll show you some of my previous work, notably, to give you a bit of context for those people who are less familiar with what I do. and I'll then expand on the project presented here at Barakat. And I'll subsequently also show you a little sneak peek teaser, very exclusive, of my new project. This is my second show at Barakat, as Dane already explained. It's my first solo, though. I presented back then part, not entirely, but part of the series Temps Mort. I'll be expanding a little bit on the research behind Temps Mort. As first, to give you a bit of context, how I actually make my work. So there's a lot of research behind it. I'm a nerd, so there's a lot of nerdery behind it. So in some sense, all my work is research-based. So I'll give you a little insight on that. So just to give you a little insight in what Temps Mort was, because maybe not all of you have seen it back then, I'll show you a little teaser. So just to be clear, Temps Mort is like a video installation. It consists of 13 different works, of which 10 works are dumb screens and 3 works are interactive. The big work is activated by a phone call. So you get a phone number when you enter the exhibition room. When you call, the phone rings in the work, and a sort of a conversation starts between the people on screen. So this is a bit how the work is presented in the space, just to give you an idea that it's just like the Archive of Unattained Futures. It's a film that is spread over several screens and that is really presented within a space in which the spectator can move freely. So these are the 10 non-interactive works. These 3 are the interactive works in the series. So the whole series actually talks about the difference between what we say or what we present and what we feel and what we don't say. So it speaks, like all of my work, actually about the impossibility of human communication, which is kind of a perverse paradox in the age of communication. It also addresses like the way we use our electronic devices to delegate our emotions and to sort of hide behind a screen. So talking about that impossibility of communication, I had a beta of this work in which the last person who calls gets actually a text message from one of the characters. And so I had made a chatbot for it. But this was a chatbot that I made, and I'm a very bad programmer. And I made it in 2015. So there was no GPT-3, there was no AI deep learning back then. So the chatbot was really stupid. So I had the text messages ported to my phone so I could intervene if the chatbot was too stupid. And I had to. And so this resulted in good childhood memories. I had sore thumbs. I had Nintendo thumbs from texting so much. So yes, I spent many Wednesday afternoons playing video games because it rains a lot in Belgium, so there's basically nothing else to do. So I think that my youth of like gaming in the afternoon and then having an education in Bruges, so seeing a lot of classical Flemish painting, these 2 things really influenced my work. So I said that my work, it always goes around 2 pillars. So it's actually Dane who said that I have a way of structuring things in a very rigid framework, but then presenting them in a very emotional way. So that was, Dane is a genius. So that was very interesting to hear, because it's true. I can see it in all my projects. So the framework for Temps Mort is based on the Ars Moriendi, which means the art of dying. It was a pamphlet that originally dated back from 1415 and that circulated during the time of the pest. It was a sort of a manual to help people die well before God, which was beautiful because, I mean, it was a time when death was a punishment of God, so it was actually quite humanistic in that sense. So the pamphlet would always be accompanied by woodcuts. There were, of course, different versions that circulated during that time. But it would always mention 5 distinct stages that the dying person would go through. So 5 seductions from the devil, so to speak. So on the woodcut, there's always a dying person who is depicted with around him, because it's always a man, either devils depicting a particular seduction, or angels with a proposed solution, so to speak, towards God. So I will just quickly show you a few of them because they're so beautiful. Aren't these magical? They're really nice, no? This is a really beautiful colored one. And so the 5 characters in the story, they actually, it's the paterfamilias who commit suicide. So they each actually go through this dying stage by proxy. So it's not them who are dying, but it's somebody else who died, but suddenly. So they couldn't really go through the mourning process easily. So they each represent one of those stages that is mentioned in the pamphlet. And so I structured the whole story around those 5 stages. So yeah, Dane is totally right. I have this way of using a very rigid framework as a sort of I don't know, like a portmanteau, or like an easy way for me to then expand on something very emotional from that framework. So there are many more references to and little winks at. There are a lot of narrative techniques that I actually stole from the great masters within this series, but maybe that's not for today, that's for a lecture that is a bit longer. But so Temps Mort is really a very important pillar in the evolution of my artistic practice, or it has been, because it was the first series in which I started kind of to find my own form, like a way of telling stories over several screens. So to me, this strikes me as a more contemporary way, because I grew up with so many screens around me. And then, you know, I grew up with a Nintendo, so I sort of want to interact with the art as well. Yeah, I spent many hours as a kid in art galleries. So I couldn't touch anything. So I found it very frustrating. So I thought, maybe I can make something that people can actually touch. So, but after Temps Mort, I really felt that I still had a lot to learn, especially, I mean, in life in general, I guess, but especially from cinema. So when I got invited to be a student at the prestigious French school 𝐴𝑝renois, I was really very honored to accept. So I was very lucky that at the time that I was at 𝐴𝑝renois, Belatar was a visiting professor there during the 2 years of my education. And I was very lucky to become one of his students. He is to this day, he's like my mentor in cinema, a dear friend, a coach. Yeah, he's a very important person for me. I don't know if everybody is familiar with Bela's work, so I wanted to show you a little scene from Werkmeister Harmonies, just basically because everybody needs to see this in their life, because it's so beautiful. Isn't this beautiful? So I was so lucky to be his student for 2 years, and I made 2 films at 𝐴𝑝renois, 2 classical films, Jour des Crêpes and Nesting. So my graduation film, Nesting, was part of Nisi Massa, which is a European network of young cinema, the focus selection they did for Cannes at the Cannes Film Festival in 2019. So I was very lucky. So I'll show you just a few minutes here of the film. So making films for 2 years was really interesting because it taught me a lot about cinematic language and about the usage of sound in combination with image. And it just granted me a perspective on art which was less from a painterly tradition. And so both Jour des Crêpes and Nesting were classical films in that sense that they are made for cinema, they can be presented in cinema, and they are linear in the sense that they go from A to Z and then just finish. And I learned a lot, I did love making it, but I still felt a little bit limited by the single screen medium. So, as I said, being a Nintendo generation kid, I thought it was interesting to have some interaction at least with one of the pieces, or to at least see pieces on several screens and make the story into a world where you step into, more than, you know, a black box cinema where you step into. And so after Livre Noir, the way I saw it was to reshape my practice so that each project will have one piece that could be presented in cinema, theoretically, but then has also accompanying pieces that stand on themselves, just like the main piece, but kind of give more context to the story world if somebody wants to discover it in a more artistic setting. So the combination of those things, it results in an installation that I hope would build on a tradition of Cinema Expanded, which is more abstract and more about pushing the boundaries of what cinema is in itself. And it would use that tradition, but interweave the explicit layer of narration that is so inherent to the tradition of cinema and that I so love. So that brings us to our current exhibition. So I've conceived the Archive of Unattained Futures as a 2-act story, so to speak. The first act being Ad Hominem, the video game which you can play here downstairs, in which, as Dane already said in the beginning, the spectator plays change, returning to its hometown, looking for some recognition for all it has done, and actually coming to the conclusion that change is never really welcome. And then in the second act, the archivist, a woman, addresses the spectator, and she refers to a correspondence of travel letters that Change wrote to her about the 4 mythical utopia Change visited. Each story is similar, but is contradicting in very telling ways. So the structure, again, me with my framework structures of Ad Hominem, is based on the research and writings of my good friend and genius scholar Sophie Verhaest. In her doctoral thesis, Utopia Unbound, she defines 4 different tropes or style figures, if you will, of 𝐴𝑈topia that circulate in Western literature. So she investigates how the concept of a good place can activate stereotypical patterns of imagination, which in their turn circulate in a culture as a collective simplified framework used to understand a more complex reality. So these stereotypes are, so to speak, like the pair of glasses through which we see our current times, through which we understand our history, and by which we form ambitions around what we want for our future. So per Utopia, she discusses 3 books. They're not necessarily the most canonized or best pieces of literature, but that is not the point, of course. With each selection, she shows, in fact, the spectrum of representation of these 4 ideas and the clear link between their respective representations. So her examples, each 3 of them, explicitly range from a more negative to a more positive, so more dystopic to a more utopic views on the utopia, on the 𝐴𝑈topia, the 4 style figures she defined. So these are the 4 style figures and the 12 corresponding books quoted in the thesis of Sophie. I will let you read them. I won't read them aloud. So in trying to structure, as I'm, the freak of structure, Sophie's countries of the mind, I came to the conclusion that the 4 𝐴𝑈topia she proposes in her writings can actually be put at the extremities of a matrix of 2 opposing ideas, with on the y-axis conservative versus progressive thinking, and on the x-axis collective stance versus an individualistic view on life. both axes imply, of course, a spectrum. And as reductive as this seems, Sophie agreed that this reductivity is, again, for better or for worse, a correct representation of what goes on in our minds while reading the books she quotes. So I thought, Matrix, perfect for a video game. So as I said, I grew up with a Nintendo, a 32-bit. Yes, I'm that old. We got this little wonder of tech somewhere in the mid-90s, and we played it as much as we were allowed to play. Of course, we weren't allowed to play it all the time. And we only had 5 games anyway, so it doesn't matter. And then in the hours that we weren't allowed to play, we would read like old books from the attic that we got from our family. So we read these books. Does anybody know of these? Yeah. Yeah. These are choose your own adventure books. They're very, I mean, nowadays everybody would think they're very lame, but I had a lot of fun playing them. So you would like end up at a page at a certain point and it would say something stupid like, at the forest clearing, if you want to go left, go to page 222 or something, and if you go right, go to page 322. So it was like books you could play instead of like reading them. So, bon, this is where I got the mustard, of course. I thought, oh, this would be fun to make into a very simple video game, so that's what I did. I mean, I say a simple game, but like the gameplay is very simple, but I wanted specifically to have a more philosophical stance. Like Bandersnatch, but then smart. So there are 4 levels in the game corresponding to the 4 utopia. The 4 characters are actually representative of those utopia. They speak, so to speak, for the utopia. And the world that they live in changes according to your answers. So if you agree with them, then the background behind them is more cleaner, is more utopic of an atmosphere. And if you disagree with their views, then the world behind them becomes more dystopic, so to speak. So this is the script behind it. So it has like a tree structure, and then it ends in 1 of 4 endings. So depending on your answers, you get 1 of 4 endings. I started out like writing the script together with some quotes from Sophie's thesis, but it became a bit too literature nerd, which I am a literature nerd, but not everybody is. So instead of choosing quotes from those books, I started integrating some quotes from philosophers and sociologists and political scientists. Of course, I have to put in the caveat that these are all Western sources and not Eastern sources, and I'm very sorry for that, but I don't have any access nor knowledge of the language, so in that sense, it's very biased. So the first quote that you see when you start playing the game, I won't let it run entirely because you have to play it afterwards, but is from Ezra Pound, from his collection of essays, Make It New, which is like a foundational collection of essays that was was foundational for modernism or modernist philosophy in the West.
Words rise to the surface of your deliriously tired brain. Her language is vaguely familiar to you. Speaking it feels like a cold stone in your mouth, not unpleasant, but
I'll let you play the rest. So then there is the second act, The Archivist, in which you change rights actually to an unknown woman about these 4 countries of the mind, resulting in 4 collections of videos with a narrated voiceover. So as Dane said at the beginning, the series is actually composed of images found in the public domain. A lot of these beautiful collections are now available online, and I would really highly encourage you to take a look at some of them because they're incredible. So the Public Domain Review is a website that has a wonderful newsletter. It's about the only newsletter that I read. Doesn't everybody hate newsletters, right? But it's very inspirational because they review these collections that either have fallen into the public domain or have been digitized recently. So you get to discover a lot of like beautiful collections of photographs, but also drawings. And so from this source, I kind of found out about the New York Public Library, their public domain collection, which is incredible. They did like a great work of digitizing a lot of these beautiful photographs. And they are available just, you know, for use and reuse explicitly so, because they even had a residency at some point, which I think got cancelled either because of budget cuts or because of COVID, where they invite artists to, I think the residency was called Remix or something. So they invited you explicitly to use these images and to put them in a new context and give them new life and so on. So I've collected these for years on hard drives, thinking they would amount to a project at a certain point. And when I was working on The Archivist and trying to write the story and trying to come to like a conclusion what this was really about, I thought, bah, that's it. Because these are the images we collect, these are the things we keep, so they function as repositories of information, and at the same time they create information and they give us a framework by which we see things. So of course I've manipulated most of the original images a lot as to put them, you know, in a fictional space and make them actually part of the story. So most of them are like collages of 3 or 4 images that I've combined, sometimes combined with painted elements that I animated in 3D. And of course they're all made into little videos. So I don't know if you tried upstairs, but if you tap them, you can hear a voiceover, a text, and there's a little subtitle. And we also did the subtitles in Korean, thanks to Dane. So the story is actually one story with 4 transformations of it. So there's a lot of similarities between it, and then there's contradictions. And so, of course, this is, you know, part and parcel of the whole exhibition, that the whole idea of utopia has contradictions, but in the end, there's the same human need that is a link between all of them. So when I was writing the story, it was at the same time that I discovered the AI called GPT-3. So GPT-3 is a generative pre-trained transformer. It's like a deep learning neural network, or in more popular terms, which I hate, by the way, an artificial intelligence. It doesn't exist, people. Artificial intelligence doesn't exist. So what GPT-3 does best is it generates text, because it has actually 179 billion machine learning parameters, which is a lot. And it's mainly trained on a data set of text available on the web, but also, as you can see, on like 67 billion books. Of course, there is a lot of bias since the data set is Anglo-Saxon. And also, you can imagine that if it crawls the internet for its information, it's not exactly devoid of conspiracy theories and terrible racism and sexism. So you can't really leave it to do what it wants to do, because in the beginning I would have preferred for it to write the story itself, but that's not a good idea. So, but to have it as a writing partner for fiction is very, very interesting. So it's actually like conversing with the subconscious of the internet in a way, which is freaky. So you can use it in several ways, and depending also on the client, on like the software program you use for it, it's open source, so you can compile your own client with it if you're, you know, dexterous enough with that. You can ask it questions and enter into a conversation with it, which is a lot of my students do that because they think it's hilarious, which it is. Some clients allow, even some software clients allow for you to set a mood or like a political intention of your main character, and then it generates fiction. But the way I use it most is I feed it text I wrote that I am already happy with, and then I ask it to generate more text. So with varying results, honestly. So in orange is what GPT-3 wrote. So it's not very interesting here, and even a bit weirdly problematic in a way, I guess. Yeah, but then it sometimes, I had the experience that later in the day, it became more poetic. So here in gray is the text that was generated by GPT-3, and you can see it was like in a really poetic, sort of almost Lacanian mood, which is quite beautiful. So actually, this little video is the result of that specific session. So you can go and upstairs and maybe enjoy it and see where the differences between the text that GPT-3 wrote and that I wrote, where the writing partnership was. So then, as a very last and short and sweet, I hope, little teaser or eye candy, I wanted to introduce you to my last project, which is also going to be a video installation. We just finished the film part of it, which could be presented in cinema, and so we're pushing to get a nice international premiere, so maybe at the Busan Film Festival, I don't know. So just to give you some quick context, it's based on a short story by Franz Kafka. If you're interested, I can send it to you, and it's about a group of 5 people where a 6th one wants to join them, and they don't really know why they're a group to begin with, but they don't want to accept the 6th person. So voilà, it's kind of a metaphor for everything that's going on in Europe right now with the migrant crisis and so on.
I was very curious about your sense of beauty, because at the beginning, at your first work, Tammo, it was the ideal character. They look beautiful in a very, I would say, non-classical way, because of course it reminds us of Vermeer and the Flemish, but today we won't consider them beautiful until now. That maybe some fashion houses we consider beautiful because of their strangeness or quirkiness. And then on the last work that you depicted us, then your sense of beauty somehow changed and remind us more like the character of Cindy Sherman. So the idea of emphasize somehow the difference to make them memorable. So I really was curious about how your sense of beauty evolved.
It's a good question. Yeah, so I think in the beginning it was more really from a painterly tradition that I mirrored myself on. Maybe also more from a photographic tradition, because that was the way I was educated. And then, I always had this obsession with medieval and high Renaissance art, which is still palpable through all the projects, I think. But I don't know, I go through obsessions with painters. Like my last obsession, and unfortunately she passed away 3 days ago, Paula Rigo. Oh, yeah. Oh, I love her work so much. Yeah, so I go through phases. It's sometimes I have this painter that I'm completely obsessed with. Like when I was making Ad Hominem, the game, I was extremely obsessed with Neo Rauch. And then I sort of have to work through them, and then, I don't know, I end up at the other end, I guess. But I think with every project since the beginning, what I find interesting is deforming the natural a little bit. So it's like this little sweaty finger that's like pointing at the absurdity of the quotidian. because the stories in themselves are not that shocking. It's more, yeah, if you put a quotidian story in like a surrealistic space, then it says something about reality, you know what I mean?
I'm super interested in how you develop your concept of utopia, how you researched into it, and especially in the Eurocentric framework as well. And I was wondering, first question, like you researched so much into it, and so I was wondering how you understand utopia yourself, and if like your understanding of utopia from like the beginning of your research to the outcome of the game and your research like developed, and in which way, as utopia is so constant in human thinking from, I think, almost the beginning of time, and despite like the themes changes, the narrative changes, it is still something that we dream of and that reflects a lot the reality we live in. And I love how you set the framework of this idea that utopia and how we imagine the future, an impossible future as well, like reflect on how we understand the present. So super interesting in that sense. And I was wondering also, as it is part of like the video game that is interactive, if you perceived a pattern in how the outcome of the video games comes when it comes to the players.
I think my own ideas about what defines utopia have in a way become less radical over the years. I think that's also because of growing maybe a bit older, I don't know. And in another way they have become more radical because I think one of the things that is lacking the most is there is a big gap in stories that are not told. Stories of minorities, stories of women who are not minorities, who are counted as minorities, which, you know, this project, if anything, it brought to me to the front how much we are governed by the language around us. So there is no, I don't think there is an evening land of what we should desire as a society. But that's my, you know, that's my own opinion, and that's even not that interesting. I think, you know, it's in the eye of the beholder in a way. And I think as long as we, as a society, take care to add voices that are unheard, then, you know, we can get closer to something that resembles a democratic form of utopia. I don't know, but this is my 5 cents about it. I have, you know, I have no idea of how to go about this. And then when it comes to the pattern of the game, I mean, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek sometimes because and some of the questions are just there to push the story forwards, and you get a score anyway. So it's a bit of a joke at the same time as well. But I do have the impression that people think of themselves as a certain way. So they think of themselves as progressive or collectivist or whatever. And then they end up agreeing like with the weirdest quotes, you know, with like really conservative things. And if I don't catch I could catch myself doing that as well, you know, like choosing something and then say, oh shit, that was Ayn Rand, that's terrible, you know? So yeah, I think that is also a question of like context and political correctness, and so, but don't take the game too seriously. It's also, it's made to make you think. It's not necessarily made to give you an answer, so.